to introduce Jim Glassman.
Thanks. Well, Chase is thrilled and proud to support the manufacturers across the Puget Sound area. It's important to our business as well for the manufacturing industry here to be strong. We also are very pleased to support the M2M, the military to manufacturing program within camps. Pleased to sponsor Jim Glassman this morning to give us an economic update. Jim has been with Chase for about 3 decades and is our head economist for the commercial bank. In that role, Jim speaks to our local markets across the country. He gives us bankers a weekly update, and he publishes a weekly podcast of economic news. And so with that, please join me in welcoming Jim Glassman. Jim, glad to have you.
Thank you, Joe. So my family grew up in Seattle. My dad's from Queen Anne Hill, and I remember going to Seattle, going to Washington. I've got friends out in Spokane. I've got a childhood friend who was a mayor of Blaine, very northern town, way up north. And I got to tell you, so I've been I've been keeping an eye on Washington, and you guys have gone through an amazing transformation over the decades. I remember sometime in the 1970s is when all of a sudden I noticed all my friends, my friends' kids were talking about going to Microsoft and tech jobs out in Washington. So what I think is really interesting about the state is you would think, I mean, what we've been going through here in the last year has just created so much upheaval, but a lot of the upheaval is centered in hospitality and leisure, air travel, and the school systems. And actually, the surprising thing is that manufacturing has actually kind of recovered. It's almost back, about 98% of where we were back in February last year, which is interesting. So I think you guys are kind of in the middle. When I look at what's going on in Washington and Puget Sound, you kind of look like a carbon copy of the nation in terms of employment trends and things. And it's odd because you would think if you have a pandemic and the whole world is frozen, nobody's traveling, air travel in the U.S. is coming back. We're back about half the normal level. It's just creating havoc though for the airline system, and everybody is rethinking needs for for aircraft. The industry, Boeing had massive backlog of orders, but I think there's been some cancellations because people are rethinking what the future might look like. I think it's way too early to reinvent the future yet because of what's going on right now. But I think maybe the reason you would think on top of the struggle that the airline system is having and what that means for manufacturing, at the same time, as you know, Boeing's MAX 8 has been, they turned the lights out last year and they have not been producing anything. Now it's starting to change, but that's sort of been a double whammy for the area. The struggle that Boeing was having with the 737 MAX 8. But at the same time, despite the challenges of the airline system, the whole world, the U.S. is woken up to what you can do with technology. And you guys are ground zero of the online, all the online technology that's been going on. I mean, every day I go for a walk, I'm tripping over Amazon boxes. And that was a big story of what happened here. So you got a lot of things, a lot of cross currents, but I really think we've done a pretty, we've been able to get over the hurdles of this first round of disruption. And I really think what's coming for the country as a whole, 2021 is looking much more promising to all of us. And I think that combined with Boeing's change of fortunes, I think is going to be a real plus for the Puget Sound area because the MAX 8, Boeing is now planning, as you know, to raise production slowly for that aircraft to about 31 planes a month. This is a big deal for me because the economic value of that MAX 8 in the aggregate, the final, when you look at the value of the planes that come out of that get shipped out, it's worth about $50 billion, which is has a very noticeable footprint. Now, a lot of the value of that chain isn't just in the Puget Sound. There's supply chains coming from all over, like with the 787. So I think, honestly, I think for all the challenges you've had, I think folks in the manufacturing sector should feel a little bit better. If I told you a year ago, back in February, we're going to have a pandemic, we're going to have to shut the system down, it's going to be a nightmare, you would have guessed. I think it would have been reasonable to guess that manufacturing is going to it's going to be a big challenge. But actually, output is back. We ended the year almost back to where we were. Now, manufacturing jobs are not. We've only recovered about half of the jobs that we lost in manufacturing, which means a lot of the activity is happening in the higher productivity areas. It's worth just thinking. My feeling from day one was what we're dealing with is not like a business cycle. This is more like a natural disaster where you're hit with a shock, but there's a bunch of things going on that make this look different. It may feel in the moment, it might feel as bad as a business cycle, but the difference between a natural disaster and a business cycle is if we mobilize resources to try to protect people and help us get through this, it all happens faster, and that's really what's going on. So when you think about what happened last year, national economy dropped about 15% below the path that we would have been on had we not had a crisis. And that was, for March and April were the nightmare months. And then starting in May, the economy began to recover. And by the end of the year, we kind of got back to about 95% of where we would have gotten. Now, and that's because of the following things. All this technology that's been percolating for the last couple decades, well, we woke up and discovered that, I may not be able to get to the office, but I can still work from home. So most people found that they could sort of transition. It took a few weeks to figure this out, but we transitioned everybody to working remotely from home. Consumers figured out that if I can't shop, if I can't go to the mall, well, I can go online. And online transactions exploded back in May. And if we can't be in the office or go visit clients, at least we can communicate virtually like this. It's not great, but it's better than not being able to do it. So I think the technology that's been kind of getting developed over the last couple of decades, it really enables us to transition more smoothly to this shutdown than we could have done 10 years ago. I don't think this would have worked 5-10 years ago because I've been doing it because I travel a lot. I do connect remotely, but I remember it didn't really get easy until about 5 years ago. Thirdly, we always knew that this is a medical problem, and so we wouldn't really be out of the woods until we had a medical answer. Well, we've been counting, really, in the equity markets, people have known about this messenger RNA technology that Pfizer and Moderna were developing, and we were always relatively optimistic that by the end of the year we would have vaccines in place. And at the end of the day, we knew that you could not get over the hurdle until you had the population vaccinated. But the thing that really changed the dynamic the most, and what you guys are feeling, is that in response to the lockdowns, honestly, I don't think this was the smartest way to handle a pandemic, but we had no other options. Shutting down the economy is probably the worst possible thing you can do because we don't know. You'll never know the health consequences of doing what we just did. And we have a very complicated economy. We have a complicated world economy. We're all very interconnected. It's so easy to create unintended consequences when this happens. But thankfully, at least what they did in Washington was they realized that we better try, if we're going to ask restaurants and bars and fitness centers and the airline system to shut down, don't allow business travel, well, then we better try to figure out how to help people. And that's exactly what they did. So, by March 27, by the evening of March 27 last year, you kind of knew what was coming because Washington authorized the release of a $4.5 trillion of money to be spent. A lot of it, some of it was to the airlines, some of it was to the healthcare system, but a lot of it was focused on the furloughed workers. We kind of knew in the early days that there were, when you asked people to not go to restaurants and bars, fitness centers, and ask them to stay home, it was really the small business community that bore the brunt of that. And we knew within weeks in March, we knew that there were roughly 30 million people who were going to get furloughed because of all this. And then there's like 10 million people who are Uber drivers and Lyft drivers and, gig workers who had no access to unemployment insurance. So we knew right away there were 40 million people who were going to be in trouble. And that kind of motivated, I think that kind of focused the effort in Washington to make sure that we had enough money going to people like this to help them. So what Washington did kind of worked on two fronts. Doubling unemployment insurance benefits, creating the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, which created a program for gig workers who were unemployed because they didn't have access to unemployment insurance. And what that did, if you looked at bank deposits or you looked at the income statement of the household sector, what you saw was stunning. We shouldn't have been surprised by it. And this is the reason, by the way, the banking industry was taken aback by this. The finances of the municipalities were much better off because of this. What we really did, what all those actions did, is they basically gave furloughed workers paid leave. And so, and what I mean by that is all that the benefit, a typical guy who got unemployment insurance was getting about $1,000 a week, which is the equivalent of about $52,000 a year. And when you ask Uber drivers or waiters who worked at restaurants who were not working, but they were getting unemployment benefits, if you ask them how they were doing, the ones that I talked to said, I'm getting a little bit more money than what I was at my job. That became an issue later in the year, in the summer, when these benefits, when businesses were opening up, because a lot of guys were having trouble pulling people back in because they were not real thrilled about coming back to work as long as they were getting paid. And by the way, this is the reason why when you look at what you're feeling, this is really what happened because of those actions and because of the special program, Paycheck Protection Program, where we gave small businesses the resources to cover their costs for at least 2 months. What all that did is it sort of kept people, it gave people the resources to get back to life once we let businesses start to open up and let hospitals start doing elective procedures and all that. And this is why, when you look at what happened last year, consumer activity began to spring out of the gate in May. By the time you got to late summer, consumer spending was about where it was prior to the crisis. Car sales have, consumer purchases of car sales, they pretty much have gone back to normal and made back all those deferred purchases. It's the business purchases that are tied to air travel that are still struggling. Real estate activity exploded. Rent payments, a sign of financial health of individuals, really didn't change that much. And municipalities, tax revenues for most municipalities still grew over the 12 months ending last September. They grew about 3%. The year before that, they grew 5%. Property tax collections were normal. Income tax collections were normal. Business income tax collections were normal. Sales tax collections were down. So and the reason why all this happened, by the way, is because if you give people, if you compensate people for the lost income, then they have the resources to make good on to honor their financial obligations. And that's why the banks, fearing there were going to be a lot of losses and write-downs and defaults, had to reserve a lot. And by the end of the year, they realized it wasn't, and that maybe they went overboard. So they started releasing reserves. So this is why when you step back and you ask, how did we do last year? It brought, there was a lot of heartache for sure. and it was very disruptive for people who were in the services industry. But if you were in the universe that produces physical things, manufacturing. By the way, this is China's story. If you look at China's economy right now, they grew faster last year than the year before. You know why? Because think about all the things that we buy. When consumers are buying things, made in China. So China, the U.S. market, is fundamental to China's success. And it's just a reminder that the world has gotten very interconnected. They depend on us. We depend on the opportunities we face in that region. And, despite the tension between the U.S. and China, there's a lot going on in Asia, and it's very important to us and it's very important to them. And so if you were at all, my clients who just could not keep up with business were all the guys that produce home improvement projects, home improvement things. So anything related to consumer purchases of cars, capital goods other than aircraft. And so here's so the main challenge we have right now, by the time we came into the new year, we ended up sort of recovering gradually over the course of last year. We ended up with our economy about 5% below where we would have been had there been no crisis. Now there's a couple things going on right now that have changed the picture for 2021. And most of my peers have turned very positive, and you haven't seen the end of the story yet. We came into the new year realizing they had signed off on another $900 billion to extend unemployment benefits that were expiring and a bunch of things. And right away, the action they took around Christmas effectively, in our minds, made us think this is going to boost growth by about 3 percentage points. So in the early days of this year, there's a consensus view that the U.S. economy is going to grow about 5% this year. And that's prior to thinking about the Biden administration's proposal. So there are two things going on here. The Biden administration proposal, the $1.9 trillion, you might say, well, gee, we're doing okay. Why do we need this? Well, I think the attitude in Washington is it's far better to go overboard than to go underboard, because because basically we only have one chance here to take another big stab at trying to get us over the final hurdle, because we have a split House in the Senate. When you have a 50-50 split, you can't get anything done, except for one thing. What you can do, you can take action, anything that affects spending or revenues. That is the one exception, other than some nominations. That is the one exception. There's a process in the Senate called the reconciliation process that only requires a 51 vote majority to pass legislation that affects spending and revenues. So I think the administration wanted to have a bipartisan bill, but they're having a hard time coming up with one. And I think what this means, though, is you're going to see this $1.9 trillion initiative that the Biden administration wants. It's going to come through one way or the other. It's a more complicated process to do it the way they're going to do it, but it's going to come through. And right away, then, what that means is for us economists, we think, well, when you're thinking about 2021, what that means is you're going to be when the dust settles, you're going to be talking about growth of 8 to 10% this year, which more than makes up for the loss that we saw last year. Last year, our economy contracted 2.5%. We normally grow about 2%, so that's why we're 5 percentage points shy of where we want to be. But I think the thing more important than the money, frankly, I really think the key to 2021, we always knew this, the key to 2021 is getting people vaccinated, getting control of the virus so that we can let people go to restaurants and let people go to the gyms and let people go to the bars and let people go to the symphony and let people travel. And that's more about getting a grip on the virus than it is about throwing money out there. The money is necessary just to make up for the lost income that has not been taking place over the last year and until we get there. But I think now we all are turning much more optimistic about our ability to get a grip on the virus, because already the cases are dropping sharply. We've now reversed, we're now back to where we were prior to Thanksgiving in terms of the new cases. The burden on the hospitals has fallen down about 30%. And it's dropping back to where we were prior to Thanksgiving. And we're getting 1.6 million people vaccinated per day now with just 2 vaccines, but we have 3 more vaccines coming. So when the Johnson & Johnson vaccine gets approved for emergency use and the other 2 come out, we're going to be able to, you're going to see some really striking improvement in the effort to vaccinate the public. And I don't know whether, as you see the cases slowing down and the burden on the hospital slowing down, I don't know whether this is because it's just a natural thing that's happening and people are getting more careful, or whether it's the fact that we're actually vaccinating people that's making the difference. Why this matters is because this is the reason why we have all this upheaval. Last year, the health officials told us, well, look, the only way we can control this is by asking people to stay clear where they cluster together. So health officials recommended that we quarantine restaurants, bars, fitness centers. And the whole idea behind that was we need to manage the burden on the hospitals because we don't want to put professionals, the healthcare professionals, in the position of deciding who gets the ventilators and who doesn't. But now, so we know that anything we're doing to get this, to get some control over the burden on the hospitals is the sooner that happens, the sooner we can let people go back to restaurants and bars and fitness centers, the sooner we can let people travel, the sooner anyone connected to air travel will start feeling better. So you guys, part of Washington's economy is thriving because we've all been forced to move to online activity. So if you're in retail, that's great. If you're in manufacturing, you're kind of doing okay because we're all sitting at home. People are realizing they need to improve things at home. You wouldn't believe the kind of things people will pay for, or the plumbing stuff in their bathrooms. We've got clients down in Atlanta that produce, I don't know what these toilets do. They must talk to you or something. People spend a lot of money on this stuff. And what they tell me is that, well, the problem is people they're not taking vacation in Disney World, so they're using the money to improve, to upgrade their apartments. They're realizing they're going to be in their house more. They think they're going to be in their house more. And that's where we are right now. So anybody who's in the home improvement business or real estate activity, physical things that, if I defer purchase of a car, when the dealership is open, I'm going to go get it again. So those are not lost. If what is lost, if I don't go to the symphony this weekend because they don't want anybody around, I'm not going to go to 5 symphonies the minute they open up. So the service sector is taking a real big hit, but the physical world is in much better shape because if we postpone transactions, much of this stuff can be just rescheduled. So I really think when you think about 2021, I think for the nation as a whole, the outlook is looking really promising. Because I think personally, by the end of this year, we're going to have the economy back where we started. And that's the difference between a business cycle and a natural disaster. If this were a business cycle, this would take us quite a few years to get out of, like the last one did. But because this is a natural disaster, that we're deploying a lot of resources to help people get back, and we're just waiting for the all clear so we can let people start going back to something more normal. And so I think the biggest question on people's minds, and I don't know if commercial real estate touches your world that much, the biggest thing on people's minds is people ask, well, how is life going to change in the future because of this crisis? And I really, personally, I think it's way too soon to be reinventing the future because this is a medical problem. It has a medical answer. And ask yourself, what will be different if we have a vaccine and suddenly we put this nightmare behind us, do you really think that things are going to change that much? I just know the thing that comes to people's mind is, yeah, we all love the idea. If you live in Seattle, you know what I'm talking about. We love the idea that we don't have to commute to go to work. But people forget there are a lot of benefits of doing things the way we used to do it. Going to the office to work. Going to the office, it's not just the social milieu. It's how you learn stuff. It's how you get noticed. It's how you advance through an organization. And I honestly think that once the danger is past and we have the medical answer, you're going to find that competition is going to drive us back to where we were, because that is the most efficient way. That's how you build a culture in a company. That's how young people learn. It's not a mystery to me when we survey our employees a while ago. What we found was the younger you are, the more you want to be in the office. You can sort of understand why, right? Because that's where you learn stuff. I mean, honestly, I've been at this for a long time. If I have a question for somebody, it's very complicated. I can't to get on my computer and find the person and hope they have the time and they're around. It's impossible. You do this if you have to do it, but this is the worst way to work, if you ask me. Remote connecting, it's the worst way to work. And I really think you're going to find that the minute this danger passes, and believe me, if I were 22, I would be just like all the 22-year-olds that I see. They are not afraid of this thing. The only reason we're nervous about things is because we don't want to expose our parents and our grandparents. But the minute we feel like everybody is safe and protected and there's a medical answer for this, there's going to be a rush to get back, I think, to the way we were doing things, because that is the most efficient way to work and learn. So honestly, if you listen to, the Fed or the Congressional Budget Office or all the officials who talk about how to think about 2021, people are super conservative in the way they talk about it, because they're trying to push the Biden administration through. I don't really think you need much effort. I think our problem is we know that the coronavirus nightmare is the central issue in America. So when you have a changing of the guard in Washington, it makes sense that the new team coming in is going to want to take a big swipe at trying to figure out how to get this behind us. And so I think they all know that getting the population vaccinated as fast as we can is the number one priority. And then taking care of people who are still struggling until we get to the other side is the second priority. And I think that's what you're going to see. So my guess is in a couple months from now, you're going to hear all kinds of crazy ideas about, this is going to be a very strong year, because there's a lot of help coming through the pipeline. And we've made a lot of progress last year already anyway. And I think by the end of the year, I would be shocked if unemployment is not back down to 3.5% to 4.5%, where we were. And, so when you step away from all this, I think the thing that's most surprising, it's not really surprising, but the thing that's most amazing, but it shouldn't be, is what the equity market's doing. I think I always listen to the equity market because we say a lot of things, but how people invest their money tells you a lot about what they really think. And I think when you realize that the equity market a year ago, if I told you we're going to have a pandemic, 40 million people are going to lose a job. We'll struggle to help them out. My guess is you would have thought this is going to be a very bad year for the equity market. Stock market rose 18%. We're now at the highest level relative to our size of our economy, except in the 1920s. And so I think, to me, I think it's not a mystery why the equity market did okay in the last year, because you're you're supposed to look through short-term shocks like that. And I think what the equity market's telling you is it's validating the idea that this is more like a natural disaster, a big disruption to the economy, but we're going to get through it. And now I think as you watch what's playing out, it pretty much validates that idea. And the question really is, then why is the stock market valued at, it's almost twice the size of the US economy? I always thought it should be about equal to the size of the US economy. And I think, well, I think personally, when I think about all the things that I've been struggling with to understand, I think what you're seeing in the equity market is confirming there are some big things going on. The world that we are living in right now is changing very dramatically. The economy is not as inflationary as we learned in school. That's changing. That's why the Fed is changing the way they talk about things and operate. The technology that's been going on, the innovation that's been going on for the last couple of years is changing the way we shop, we work, we do things. It's making you guys much more innovative. The manufacturing sector was kind of on the front lines of innovation. And and then one more thing, two other things actually. The world around us is waking up and wants to go to work. It's dirt poor. Much of the world is dirt poor. Living standards are 5 to 20% of our living standards, and they want to wait. They want to go to work. They want to raise their living standards. That's what Asia is all about. That's why there's so much opportunity opening up in Asia for us, because we operate there as well. But I think the other thing that it's part of the background here is that, in my mind, the European experiment is a really unique experiment. The European region has been a big source of instability for the world for 2,000 years. And this crisis, this COVID crisis, did something really interesting to us. You might have heard about it last summer. They're still trying to figure out how to come together as a region. And they came up with an agreement last summer, which is what we call a fiscal union. So to get a fiscal agreement that would help the southern tier, which is not doing so well. And so the crisis has really kind of brought Europe even closer together. The integration effort is still moving together, which means to me that the future doesn't look as unstable. You could have worried that the pandemic would tear apart Europe again. And we all know Europe has been a real source of instability for the past century, World War I, World War II. So to me, this is an important part of the background, which is probably contributing to the idea that you heard from the words that ring in my mind still. When Putin annexed Crimea, one of my favorite world leaders, she is a preacher's daughter. She's a physicist. She speaks Russian. She grew up in the Soviets, under the Soviet umbrella. And when Putin did that, this is Angela Merkel, what she said was, look, we don't live in the Cold War anymore. The world is changing. We're all becoming much more interconnected. And there's a lot we have to benefit from that. And people who do things that will disrupt that are going to find that's going to do more harm to them than to the rest of the world. And that's the world we're living in. And I really think that's the big story of our time. That's the story that, to me, is getting reflected in the equity market. So just one final comment, because I really think manufacturing, to me, is the star of the world that we're sort of moving into, because there's a lot of innovation going on. There's a lot of innovation you can do. And I think, you know, when I've been watching something really dramatic, in my mind, what's going on in manufacturing is probably part of the political turmoil that's going on in the US. Because when I look at things, when I got out of grad school, there were almost 21 million people working in manufacturing. 21 million. You know what that is now? 12 million. So we have lost 7 to 9 million people, 9 million jobs. And it's very disruptive. Why is this happening? You know, some people say, well, it's China, that, you know, the apparel jobs, the textile jobs all moved to another part of the world. But the truth is, it's about automation. It's about the robot in the auto plant. When you go to an auto plant and you see the typical auto plant, most manufacturing places I've been to, it doesn't look like anything like what I saw when I was in school. They're clean, they're attractive places to work. There's a lot of automation, there's a lot of robotics going on, and that's really what's been driving a lot of this disruption in the industrial sector. And I don't think, for that reason, I don't think this crisis that we went through, this pandemic, is going to change the story. I don't think you're going to see a lot of resourcing of activity, supply chains that went abroad, because I think the real dynamic going on in manufacturing is all the automation. And to me, I know it's disruptive. I know we're supposed to respect, when jobs are taken out, that's a social problem. But to me, automation creates opportunity, and it creates better jobs for people. And what it means is we just have to work harder to figure out how to train people for the jobs that you guys need. And I really think, in Zoom calls that I've had, they're obsessed with this idea in Delaware, which is where Biden came from. They were obsessed with this idea because we look at the US and we find the government tells us there are almost 7 million jobs that the businesses can't fill. And that tells you that a lot of our kids are just not trained well, they don't have the right skills for some of these jobs. And I tell them, from my experience, when you look at what's going on in the Carolinas, it tells you a lot about what you can do to get people trained for the kinds of jobs, because these European companies come in, they talk to the community colleges, they help them understand what kind of special skills they need. And then the community college offers those programs, and the kids come out with, skills that are much better paying jobs. And I think it tells you there are smart, when I hear about innovation and I see what's going on, I think, yes, I know it's tough for a 55-year-old who might have lost his job to the robot, but it's opportunity for the next generation of people coming in. And it's a big challenge because you can't expect businesses to train people for a skill, then they become marketable and they jump. This is really the role of the public sector, the education system. It used to be that the unions did a lot of this, the job shop, but we don't have a lot of people belonging to the unions anymore. So we don't have that. That's how you sort of figured out, what could I do to get retrained for some other job? So lots of challenges, I think, but I think lots of opportunities. And I have to tell you, I have friends who are always criticizing when they find out when they know I'm an economist. They're always criticizing. They say, what is it about you and the business community that are always driving to be more efficient? Why are you doing what? And so you automate and you innovate. And I said to him, what is it about you that's always looking for the best deal? Because you're the guy that is making us live like that. If the customer is always looking for the best deal, it's a competitive world, and that's how you survive. And that's why we're doing what we're doing. So you can't blame businesses. That's how you survive. And that's what's going on. And I don't think that the competitive pressure is going to continue, because the world is getting more and more competitive. But it's promising. And I think, to me, one of the amazing things about watching what happened in the last year, when you have a shock like this, what you realize is this is an amazing system, that you can go through a jolt like this, and it didn't take people too long to figure out how to work around, and we have enough options for people to sort of shift gears. And it's just a reminder how resilient the whole system is. And that's the benefit of a lot of what's been going on over the last several decades.
Well, Jim, I want to thank you so much. This has been a great presentation, and I think it's brought up several comments and several questions here. If it's okay, if I
Yeah.
kind of take you through the
Yep.
questions.
Yeah.
So Gretchen is an owner of a manufacturing company, and she said that they're an industrial manufacturer and they're servicing global industries such as aerospace, oil and gas, aluminum, energy, automotive, and et cetera. And said we saw a small uptick in sales in this January, but not back to where it was a year ago. How long would you say it will take for a company like ours to rebound and back to the early 2020 sales figures?
Yeah. By the way, you should know the two industries you talked about are the nightmare: oil and gas, and
Yeah.
airline and aircraft, right?
Yeah.
And this has been plaguing us for 2 years. So remember back in 2014, oil prices crashed because we found this boatload of supply. It's the shale revolution, right? And the U.S. has become the largest producer of oil because of that. And what happened was oil prices crashed, and then everything kind of chilled. 2015, 2016. You may not realize, anybody who was indirectly connected to the oil and gas industry, uh, what you went through was a nightmare because activity slowed down. And then in 2017, going into 2018, you began to recover. Oil and gas did slowly, and then it kind of like didn't. And the problem with the pandemic was when we all froze. Nobody's flying, nobody's driving, so oil demand collapsed. And so if you're in Texas, a lot of those projects got shut down. Well, I really think you're seeing all kinds of silver linings now showing up here because when I'm on the roads down here, it's all jammed up again, and oil demand is picking up. And you've noticed oil prices are starting to recover. These guys in the oil industry are very sensitive to oil prices. When oil prices go up, sure enough, rig activity picks up, and so you're starting to see some signs of that. We're nowhere near where we were. But we will get there. In my mind, oil prices around $50 a barrel. I tend to think we're not normal until we get to 60 to $70 a barrel. And when you get there, the lights will come back on for energy activity. But the second problem you had aerospace. That's a Boeing story. So that's the MAX problem. So Boeing was still producing back in 2019 as they were filling up the Lake Moses and Everett Field, Boeing Field. But then they turned the lights out last year because it was taking longer to get this thing recertified.
Yeah.
But that changed last winter. The grounding is now lifted, and Boeing is on the way back. And I think the real key here it's actually connected. The real key for aerospace and energy, oil and gas, is movement of the public. So if we get the virus, if we get control of the virus so that we can start letting people go back to the office, that may not happen till late spring or summer. But if we can get to that point and get air travel moving, and I know honestly, I think by the end of the year we aren't going to be talking about this very much because honestly, one thing I ask people who are on our Zoom calls, the guys who are managing supply chains overseas, I ask people, can you manage things virtually like this? And virtually everybody that I've talked to says not a chance. You cannot manage your operations in Indonesia and Malaysia. You got to be on site. I mean, there's too many differences, and people can, you only see what you can see on the screen.
Yeah.
So what that tells me is business travel is coming back.
Yeah.
Businesses may like not having to spend so much money on travel, but honestly, you miss a lot when you're not visiting people and not seeing what's going on. So
Jim,
I think that's going to change.
Yeah, thank you. And there were some some comments and questions about you talked about the loss of jobs overall in manufacturing, but how has productivity been from your point of view of manufacturing? We talked about innovation and automation.
Huge.
Been
It's
huge.
Yeah. It's a lot easier to measure productivity in the manufacturing sector because it's physical thing, physical output per hour worked, right?
Yeah.
And it's quite impressive. And I really think a crisis like this kind of accelerates it because there is a lot of technology going on, but we tend to be slow in embracing it, and we don't change the way we do things until we have to.
Yeah.
And it's survival that makes you do this. So we saw when you look at the data in labor productivity, the moments when it really took a leap forward was the financial crisis 10, 12 years ago, and last year was a big increase. So we saw an amazing recovery in national output, but employment slower. And that's just telling you, because a lot of this activity that's going on is higher productivity kind of activity.
Yeah. And so from looking forward, the larger companies seem to embrace the innovations and the automation maybe more rapidly than maybe the smaller manufacturers. But this kind of goes back to a competitive world, and maybe the smaller manufacturers need to take a lesson in being maybe in other words, it's an advantage to take advantage of the innovations and the technology versus doing it the way we've been doing it.
But I actually think the smaller manufacturers are the most dynamic. They're the front lines of this. And I think here's the problem. Well, this is an economist talking. Kodak, Microsoft, big companies don't have an incentive to reinvent when there's something new that comes along. They hang on as long as they can. Economists learn this is the problem of monopolies. Small businesses, if they see a better way, you get more dynamic things happening. It's small business, I think, drive this better, I think. And you can see it. And I think it's interesting because I heard something a while ago. People were complaining that IBM was not, they weren't internalizing a lot of the technology. They were spending money out to small tech businesses. And it sounded to me like what the problem was, they weren't sure there's so much going on. They weren't sure what was going to work. And you don't want to have to reinvent something internally, find it the wrong way. You can be going the wrong path. So they leave it to somebody else to try to figure it out. And maybe it works, maybe it doesn't.
Just out of curiosity, Jim, are you seeing any alternative energy sources or markets that are going to make a dent in the oil and gas industry?
Well, I'll just refer you to, it is interesting. I mean, you have seen battery technology making inroads in autos, but honestly, that kind of stopped a couple of years ago. And you know what it is? When fuel prices go down, guess what happens? You're not so interested in Tesla, right? and it started going on globally. But the one thing I saw, I always thought the most interesting technology was the fuel cell, hydrogen fuel cell technology. But one of my analysts wrote a piece that said, the problem with hydrogen fuel cell, which is, I guess, used to charge batteries. So that is an alternative for technology for cars. They said the problem is the price of hydrogen fuel cell technology has to fall in half before it becomes competitive.
Oh, I see.
So that's the problem. So economics, at the end of the day, economics does matter. We may have public policy that is pushing us as much as they can, and I live in a state that's trying to go totally electric. I don't think so, because I think the reality is economic reality, unless you can get the cost of these alternatives more in line with, and all the technologies are getting better. So I wouldn't be shocked if internal combustion engine just keeps getting better and better in terms of its carbon footprint.
Oh, there we
go.
So
you don't really know. And that's why market reality, the best energy policy is one that takes its cue from economic pricing. Because I might think that when I buy that Tesla, this is really clean, and it is. Except that, what about the lithium battery?
Yeah.
That is made in China, and why is it made in China? because the environmental laws are lax and because labor is cheap.
Mm-hmm.
So we as a country need to we as a people need to think about the whole system, not just what we see in front of us.
Right. Now, and that's so true. Now, another great question here is President Biden's talked a lot about investing in the manufacturing, ecosystem and R&D and American-made products. What kind of hurdles do you think they're going to have actually lifting manufacturing with these policies?
I mean, manufacturing, the high value added part of manufacturing is very centered in the U.S., right? It's the components of manufacturing that have a lot of labor input, where the labor cost differences are huge, and that's why the manufacturing. It's really interesting how it's all been kind of broken up and fragmented, and it's very hard for me to see how you can change that without creating obstacles, creating barriers that actually don't help you. It's a very tough problem.
Yeah.
I mean, Donald Trump talked a lot about this, but I didn't see much. We haven't seen much reshoring, and
Yeah.
people tell me there's a reason why you haven't. The cost advantages are enormous for
Yeah.
labor-intensive components.
Yes. Oh boy. Yeah. So economics again. So
It's about the money, isn't it? As my daughter figured out a long time ago.
So Randy Gardner made an interesting point. This is a new headline out there that GM has made a commitment to electric vehicles, and they've committed to not producing an internal combustion engine after 2035. And is that, I don't know, how does that look from your point of view in terms of a commitment like that?
Well, it's a strategy. I mean, I'll tell you though, as we've been told, in order to reach the net zero carbon target, we need to triple the capacity of our electric system to deliver electricity.
Wow.
Triple it, because all these battery cars have to go. Have to plug them into the network. Now, is it possible that we can provide the electricity for all of these 300 million cars with solar and wind? I mean, I kind of think we've maxed out on that.
Mm.
I mean, we made a lot of big gains so far. I don't know that you can replace natural gas, nuclear, to be able to support 300 million cars on the road that are battery. It's a huge challenge. So I wouldn't be surprised if, I think it sort of rhymes with the mood of the day. You sort of wonder, if you're a GM, are you always going to be working on many different technologies, or is this a marketing thing? I don't know.
Yeah. No, we don't know. So a question that came up is the idea that different presidencies, like the Trump administration versus the Biden administration, kind of have a direction or a pull. But like you mentioned, we heard a lot about helping manufacturing, but we as manufacturing and business leaders are trying to predict the future to some degree. Do you see what direction the Biden administration is steering the economy? You get a sense?
I think you're better off to think about economic reality, because politics changes, and when you're guiding policy with executive orders, these things don't last more than your term. That's the problem, and it creates big challenges for businesses, because today's fad may not be tomorrow's fad. And I mean, I remember the day that Jimmy Carter got on the television with his sweater. This was 1980. They were panicked that the U.S. was running out of natural gas. So Jimmy Carter said had an executive order to all the utilities, we need to use coal. And that's why we shifted into coal in the 1980s and 90s. We have a lot of coal. And then suddenly we realized, well, wait a minute, that's not so smart, because coal produces has a huge carbon footprint. So I think the problem is, you have to know that energy policy is a little fickle, and today's mood may not be tomorrow's mood. And if we can convince Americans to at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, did the economics make sense for a given technology? If they do, that's, you respond to that. But I think the best thing is really to know that we're probably going to try there's going to be many different options available. We don't really know which ones are going to work, and the pricing can change. And I have to tell you, my attitude about this is shaped by something I knew when I was in college. There was a thing called the Club of Rome. They predicted, it was a global, it was sort of the same. It was in the spirit of the current, atmosphere. The Club of Rome claimed that by 1990, the world would be out of oil. Out of oil. And they forgot to take account of economics that changes when the supply changes. And so, I'm happy to drive an electric car and a hydrogen fuel cell if you can get the price to a reasonable place. And that's why at the end of the day, it's the consumer, it's what's available to the consumer, what choices do they have, that really drives these things. And so you kind of have to try to look through the politics of a lot of this and ask, what is the economics of what's going on?
Well, Jim, you mentioned that your neighbor, or when you talk to your friends, that they're always looking for the better deal. And so I think a lot of our innovation, needs to think in terms of the consumer trends that are kind of being driven by economics. So I think that's, very valuable advice. So so going forward, do you see any business cycle threats to the economy? We talked about this was more of a natural disaster type threat to the economy that we just went through with the pandemic, and it was a medical solution that required a medical answer. But the concern would be things that might look like a business cycle threat.
Yeah. I think right now, because of this setback, I don't think we have to worry about this for the next 5 years. Now, and you're right. That is the thing that is more devastating to me for the manufacturing sector, because manufacturing is very sensitive to the economic cycle. And we don't know much. The one thing economists are obsessed with about economic cycles, the only way we can tell you that you might be facing trouble is when the economy recovers from a bad period. You get to low levels of unemployment, inflation starts to pick up, the Federal Reserve has to start thinking about stepping on the brakes. That's usually that's the main trigger for these business cycles that we've learned about over the last 100 years. Now, the last couple were really more about financial excesses, the housing, the housing speculation. Prior to that, the .com, telecom, terrorist attack phenomenon. So I think, there can always be some crazy thing that happens, like a meteor strike, that can throw you off course. But if you ask most economists, do I have to worry about a business cycle problem? Most of us will say, do you see an inflation problem in the next 5 years that's going to force the Fed to raise interest rates to high levels? You don't really hear anyone talking about it.
Okay.
And I think this was, right until this pandemic hit, there was a little bit of a worry going on, because this recovery had been 12 years in the making. And we've never seen a recovery the last 12 years. And so you had people saying, well, gee, unemployment is 3.5%. There's no way we can stay there without causing inflation problems. Guess what? To me, this was a huge epiphany for the Fed. If you remember what the Fed was saying last February, before the pandemic hit, the Fed was saying, you know what? We're not seeing the inflation problems that you normally expect. The economy's in a good place. I found that to be really amazing, because economists, particularly at the Fed, whenever unemployment gets really low, they always tend to get more nervous, because you never, you expect to see more inflation. And I think, what we heard from them was a story I've never heard before. What we heard from them was, you know what? There's a lot of value in running a high pressure economy, a lot of social benefits. I mean, having low unemployment, it starts to pull people in from rural areas that don't have as many job opportunities. And so and the Fed last year formally announced a change in the way they're going to be managing things. They're going to be a little more tolerant about inflation, knowing that it goes up and down over the course of the cycle. And so I really think for that reason, that makes me think that you don't really have to worry about another business cycle in the next several years that would be caused by the Fed stepping on the brakes, because
Okay.
they're more leaning in the other on the other side.
Wow, that is really great news. Part of your message here has really been to watch the economics and don't get pulled away too much by the headlines. But one of the headlines we're hearing about is that the stock market is in a bubble or creating a bubble because
Yeah.
it's so high. Do you see some stock market bubbles?
And here's the problem: stock market's always supposed to be thinking about the future.
Yeah.
And here's the problem: some people will say, "Well, the only reason we're here is because the Fed's got rates at zero." Well, guess what? The Fed only got to zero last year. The market has been rising steadily for quite some time. And here's the problem I have. I've had to I've had to reinvent the way I think about the economy since the time I came out of grad school, and three different issues going on. The economy is not as inflationary as we all learned. When unemployment gets low, it's not as inflationary, and that's what this was the epiphany for the Fed, which is why they changed the way they talk about things. This story has been brewing since 2000, since the turn of the millennium, and we've been, my friends in the academic community are constantly, they're never wrong, so they're always inventing, okay, this didn't work, but this is why it's happening. We've been struggling with this for 2 decades.
Wow.
Secondly, there is a lot of innovation going on. And I know from my own personal life, you guys know even better. I know from my own personal life that the amount of time it takes me to do things that I did when I was at the Fed. When I was at the Fed, I was involved in a function. It took about 50 of us to do something that I now do myself in 5 hours. We used to take 50 of us 2 weeks to do. So I know from my own personal life that productivity has improved dramatically, but it's not showing up in the numbers. And I think so I've been struggling to try to figure out, why is this so? And maybe the problem is innovation, productivity, new technologies. It just takes time for it to change the way we do things. It's not until somebody invents a clever thing, you see it works, and then everybody kind of embraces it. And thirdly, and this is probably more important to the stock market than anything, in the last 20 years, I kind of date this back to 2001, China. The world is opening up. India and China used to be fascinated by socialism. And they went through a transformation that said, you know what, look at the US and Europe and Japan and Korea. They are market economies. They're producing a lot better than we are. And so what's been happening in the last 2 decades is that the world around us, which is dirt poor, is transforming their economies, linking with the global economy. It's giving American businesses and European businesses, they all have access to this. I remember the day, I should have known this was happening before. I was asked to give somebody a briefing on the state of the consumer in the American economy. It was a holiday weekend. I think it was Columbus Day, 10 years ago or so. This fella who runs an amazing coffee company out of Seattle. He had invented this, he had sort of transformed Starbucks in the 1980s. And the 1980s, for us economists, 1980s, 1990s was an amazing period for the consumer, because And the way you see it, the stock market was doing better, and American households began to save less because their balance, their mutual funds were going up, so they didn't need to save. And he asked, and he wanted to know what's going on with the consumer. What should we expect? He was trying to figure out where is the consumer sector revolving to, because they had grown up in an era when the consumer was booming. And I remember asking him, do you guys think about China as a market, as an opportunity? And he said to me, well, it's really difficult to break into a tea drinking culture. That's his best market. That's their best market,
Yeah.
everywhere you go. And I remember thinking, Chinese would tell me, Chinese like to buy Starbucks. They like to hold it because it symbolizes something about where they want to go. And it's just a reminder that in the last 2 decades, this is sort of a long-winded way of saying, I don't think the market's a bubble, because there's new opportunities opening up. And so, and here's the problem. This is not a new story. This did not happen yesterday. This has been going on for 2 decades, where the level of business profits has been steadily rising. And I think it's because of innovation, and it's partly because there's a lot of opportunity abroad. And if I typically, we economists think the value. Well, but put it this way: if I had gone to sleep when I got out of grad school, and I just woke up today, and you said to me, the size of the U.S. economy is $20 trillion, where do you think the stock market is? I would tell you, well, we economists think after-tax profits are 6% of GDP. The multiple is 16 times earnings. Most of us thought that the value of the U.S. market ought to be about equal to the size of the U.S. economy. But you know where it is? It's twice the size of the U.S. economy. This is why people think you're looking at a bubble, but this has been going on for a decade and a half. And I think personally, I'm not willing to call it a bubble, because I'm still trying to answer, I'm still looking at 3 important things going on that I don't have my hands around, and they are profoundly positive for the equity market. So I personally think there's something bigger going on. I think the market is telling us that things are changing. The pandemic just kind of exposed how quickly they're changing, because we all realize that, oh, gee, we can shop online. We don't have to go to the mall. We can communicate like this. We can work remotely. We have so many more options. And meanwhile, the world around us is very connected to us. We're all connected. We in the U.S., here we have a healthcare crisis. We are developing 5 vaccines, but there's 150 vaccines under development everywhere else. So all this economic energy that's waking up is also opening up human potential. And we're just living in a different world than my parents lived. And I love, but by the way, I'm sure you guys have read this. I love the book, The Boys in the Boat. It's about the University of Washington's crew team that won the gold medal in 1936, Germany. And what's interesting about the story is it's a reminder what our parents, the economy that our parents lived in. It's fundamentally different. It's fundamentally different. And my guess is things have accelerated in the last couple of decades, partly because of what's going on globally, and partly because we unlocked, what's really driving a lot of this innovation is the speed of the microprocessing, the Moore's Law. And that's made technology more affordable, which is why it's all over the place now. And that's, to me, a big part of what's been driving this transformation of the economy.
That is huge. Well, Jim, we're down to about our last 15 minutes, but I'd like the opportunity for people to come off of mute and just ask you questions for these next 15 minutes here. Just so if you guys want to come off of mute, just to if you have any questions, kind of maybe a little bit more informal, question and answer than we've had.
And if anybody knows what those white things are behind you, where they go in the airplane, that would be great. It looks like a diving bell.
Yeah, I just picked this picture up off the internet, so I haven't figured out where it is. It might be a Boeing plant. I don't know. It's fascinating. I know
It is.
you get a lot of people asking, so maybe somebody knows what that is.
I know it's not an MP3 3D printer.
That's right.
I've done those.
Uh, so does anybody have any? You want to come off mute and just any other questions? This has been very comprehensive and I think very insightful, but also very hopeful. And I and you shared the questions that I think economists are wrestling with, and I think that's you've given really significant insights. So Jim, if we want to follow you, you're doing a weekly podcast, is that right?
Yeah, we do. It's it's designed. It's a 3 minute to 5 minute thing. It's designed to focus on the current issues, anything we might have learned last week. It's not. It's not usually all that expansive. Just more focused on what the ongoing debate is. So you might find it useful.
Yeah.
There's a lot of podcasts. Um, my favorite ones are history of Rome, the history of Byzantine Empire.
Oh yeah.
Because you learn a lot. You learn a lot of it. It's really interesting to go way back in history because you realize people weren't that different. And
Yeah.
what it makes me appreciate is we are so lucky that we live in a place that we live in. Our founding fathers did us a huge favor, inventing a system that has a lot of checks and balances,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a stable place. And for all the tension and the polarization, we didn't have a military revolution after the election, right? We had an orderly transition. We
Yeah.
are so lucky.
Allison, I know this, Allison, you came off of mute. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I guess more of a comment really, and maybe since we're having sort of a discussion at this point with Jim, I was a little bit surprised when you were talking about the fact that you expected people to, really come back into the office when, when people were able to do that again. Because I know our experience has been that before we hesitated to do remote work. Thinking that people wouldn't be as productive or whatever have you, right? But we've been really pleasantly surprised at how well it's worked for us. And myself, having a young family, we've been able to figure out how to get around school schedules and work schedules and not necessarily have to have that huge childcare cost burden anymore. So just kind of thinking a little bit more through that.
Yeah, what's interesting? So my daughter-in-law, I've got two grandsons, 4 years old. I watch, life is very difficult. And my daughter-in-law is going to be the first one to get back because trying to manage kids and their virtual classrooms and do your work is a nightmare. I think we have this debate going on internally a lot, different views on this. And I think what you're going to find, I think what I just asked myself, if I were just coming out of school and I joined the company, I would love the idea that I don't have to commute, because when I'm in New York, it takes 3 hours a day to commute. So doing remote work like this is saving me 3 hours. The problem is, if I'm 22 years of age coming out of school, I don't know anything. And it would be really tough to learn all the crazy things you have to know, the legal things, the HR things, the bank, all the stuff in our business. It's very difficult to learn on your own on the computer, because you're relying on, if you have your network, if I had 15 computers up and running, all connected to 15 different people, fine. But when you're working remote and you're juggling your kids, trying to get them to school, and the nanny's coming, it's a nightmare to do that. So I think what we're going to find is that the businesses are going to realize it's the competition from your competitors are probably going to find that's going to drive us back, because the businesses that find it's more efficient to have people around and to build culture, it's going to force other people, and some, a lot of people say, well, no, I like it. We'll have a hybrid. On days that I don't have to go to work, maybe I'll work from home. That would work fine. But I really think that at the end of the day, it may be that we'll find a more efficient way to do this all. You don't always have to be in the office, but the problem is that if you're only in the office irregularly, no one knows who they can rely on. You never know when crises are going to come up. Who do I rely on? And I had this problem when I was at the Fed. I got pulled in to learn a job that one of my colleagues was doing. She wanted to go part-time. And she said it was a nightmare being a part-timer because you never got the juicy project. Nobody knew when you were going to be around. And so they needed somebody who they knew would always be there. And so I think at the end of the day, we're going to find for our own professional advancement and, for manufacturing companies where you have to be on site, I can see you got to be on site, construction projects. But for many of us who, if you have a project and you go to the office and you're working on your computer, there's no reason why you can't do it at home. But the problem is, I think I would find that I'd want to be in the office just to make sure people know I'm around, so that when the random things come up, I'm there to help out.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. It kind of reminds me, I'm a little leery of drawing conclusions. I think the problem is you always have a tendency when you're in the middle of a strange thing to think that this is the new normal. Mm. And what you have to ask yourself is, if I'm no longer afraid of, if I no longer have to social distance and I can be around people, will I still be happy doing this? I think we'll find that competition is going to drive us back. And we may not like it because commuting is a nightmare for many of us who live in urban areas.
No, that's such a good point. Well, Allison, thank you for bringing that up. And in conclusion here, Joe, I wanted to turn the time back over to you, for any final thoughts and a little bit more promotion of JP Morgan Chase, Chase Bank, and the good things you're doing. But Jim, I want to say, just personally, in behalf of CAMPS, thank you so much for doing for the insight. It was a master.
It's a fascinating time. I got to tell you, it's a fascinating time. I think we're lucky that we live in this time.
Yeah, I think so too. Thank you. So, Joe?
Kirk, I have nothing further to add other than thanks to the CAMPS organization. And Jim, thank you so much for your presentation. Enjoyed it.
Very much.
You're great. Well, we want to thank all of you for being here.